But here is William Leitch in 1861 speaking about it as though any fool should know that this would work better in a vacuum, which makes me lead to believe that there may yet still be something else out there that Leitch had learned this from. It could have come to him from any one of those brilliant minds that were operating in the early universities in Scotland at the time.
Welcome. AstroTalk UK is a not-for-profit podcast on astronomy, science and spaceflight. Launched in 2008, it's produced by me, Gurbir Singh, a writer based in the UK. I produce this podcast for my own education, but frankly, it allows me to meet fascinating people doing interesting things. It's primarily for my own education, and I share it as a free educational resource. No ads, no subscriptions, and you don't need to log in. For more, see the About page on astrotalkuk.org. Episode 104. William Leitch, the forgotten Scottish rocket pioneer. When it comes to the pioneers of rocketry, tradition has it was Tsiolkovsky, Goddard and Oberth. In this episode, author Rob Godwin talks about William Leitch from Scotland. Leitch was writing about the principles of rocket propulsion and space travel in 1861, decades before Tsiolkovsky. Over the last few years, Rob has been researching Leitch's story and has published a book, William Leitch, Presbyterian Scientist and the Concept of Rocket Spaceflight, 1854 to 1864. In this interview, recorded via Zoom, Rob Godwin recalls how he first came across Leitch's work and the research activity that eventually led him to uncover this remarkable story. The 19th century publications that Rob refers to are now available online, and PDF versions can be downloaded. Links are available on the episode page.
Thanks for inviting me on to talk about this. I was on a business trip to Seattle, Washington. If I recall, I think it might have been one of those Apollo dinners. I think it might have been to honor Pete Conrad. I may be wrong about that, but I think Pete had just passed away, and there was a dinner going on out there. And whenever I go to places like that, the first thing I do is Google the nearest used bookshops, and then go browsing when I'm trying to kill time. And I went to a used bookshop there, and I found this book, which I don't know if you'll be able to see there, but it was called Space Travel by Ken Gatland and Anthony Kunish. Well, Gatland was one of the two principals who reformed the BIS after World War II. In 1946, he'd been running a combined interplanetary society thing during the war. And so he was like the main candidate for revamping it. And he got together with Arthur Clarke and the rest of that gang and got the BAS going again. So, Gatland's bona fides go back a long way. And I picked that book up for $5, and I was reading it on the plane on the way home. And I didn't even get, I think I've even got it bookmarked here, I didn't even get very far into it. Page 20 of his book, he writes, it is indeed surprising to find in a book called Half Hours in Air and Sky, published by James Nisbet in 1899, an accurate definition of rocket theory. And then he quotes this notion of using rockets for all of the right reasons. And then Gatland concludes, when it is considered that even today the principle of rocket motion is constantly being misinterpreted, the significance of this short paragraph written so long ago by an unknown author is truly remarkable. Well, I think Gatland's reference to 1899 was certainly what got my attention, because, I had studied and written about all the early pioneers, and generally tried to study primary sources. And I knew that 1899 was a really early date. There are some evidence that Tsiolkovsky had been writing about these things in 1899, but he hadn't published any of them. And so I was sort of very curious. Then, of course, there was the German Hermann Ganschwit, who had been writing perhaps as early as 1880, 1881 about reaction engines in space. And I thought, well, what's going on here? I mean, did somebody actually translate Ganschwit into English or something like that? But, Gatlin didn't have the advantage of Google. And so I went, and when I got home, I Googled that book that he'd mentioned, Half Hours in Air and Sky, and the edition that came up on Google was actually dated 1877, which was a huge shock to me. I mean, it was pushing it back, another 2 decades. So that eliminated Ganschwit. So now I'm thinking, wow.
So can you explain that feeling? Can you recall how you felt when you discovered this enormous jump in terms of timescale of the earliest then writing about rocketry?
I was really excited, and I was thinking that I have got to find out who wrote this, and because I'm reasonably capable researcher, I knew some of the tricks, and so what I did was I took a sentence that was a particularly weirdly worded sentence out of the essay and Googled that sentence. And instantly it brought up a book called God's Glory in the Heavens, written by a Canadian, or at least a Scottish Canadian, and that's the first edition of the book right there.
Right.
And the edition that came up, first thing was I was stunned because the edition that came up on Google was the third edition, which I didn't even notice that initially. I just went sort of straight to the extract about rockets. Then my next shock was, oh wow, this guy was in Canada. Well, that was kind of fun for me because living in Canada. And but then I noticed it said third edition, and I thought, wow. And of course, the edition of his actual book that was on Google, I think, was dated 1867, I think,
That's right.
which put it within 2 years of Jules Verne. So every step of this process was incredibly sort of eye-bulging shock. And so when I went to try and dig a little further, I found an advert for the first edition of the book, dated 1862. And then I was frankly astounded. So I went hunting for a copy of the book itself, the first edition, because I wanted to see it with my own eyes. And fortunately, this one was for sale from a book dealer in New Zealand for $20. And so I had it shipped here, and I anxiously waited for it to arrive. And then I sat and read it through. And one of the very first things that Leitch says in the book was that some of the material in it had been published in good words, which meant nothing to me. So I went looking for that, and it turns out that that was a magazine published in Edinburgh in the 1860s, and the actual volume, 1861 volume, was where the story appeared. And I had to go running out into the countryside here because it wasn't online. The first volume wasn't actually scanned. And they had it in this deep archive in the middle of the countryside at Guelph University, about 50 miles from me. And I vividly remember when they brought it out from the stack and I opened it up and I did a little dance.
And that's something I can really appreciate when you do, for somebody who's like you, been involved in space history, written about it for such a long time, to be able to see something and recognize that this is something that nobody else has appreciated. And you always wonder, can it be real? Can it be possible that everybody else has missed it so far?
Yeah, that's exactly what my feeling was. And of course, I immediately turned to my friends and colleagues who I knew were experts on the subject. And that included David Baker at the British Interplanetary Society, Frank Winter, who was the space curator emeritus at the Smithsonian, and a guy called Mike Cianconi, who was the chair of the American Astronautical Society History Committee, but also the author of a book on pre-Sputnik space writings. So I felt between those three guys, Baker had written The Rocket, which is, a fabulous tome about early rocketry. packed with information that you can't really find anywhere else prior to that book coming out. Frank Winter is well regarded as having been one of the world's leading experts on early rocketry and continues to write great stuff today. And I knew Michael knew virtually everything about every book that had come out pre-Sputnik. And so I kind of dropped it on them very gingerly and said, am I misreading this? And all three of them took their time to get back to me. David and Frank did some research and said, this looks like the real deal. And then Mike Ciancone came back to me, and Mike is he's a safety officer at NASA, working on Artemis right now. And Mike's got a very sort of interesting, inherently cautious nature about everything. He's got this very incisive way of looking at things, and so circumventing my enthusiasm a little bit, he said, "How do you know the guy wasn't guessing?" And I thought about it. And I was like, "Yeah, I really don't know." A bit like Cyrano de Bergerac with his rockets to the moon, but we kind of knew Cyrano was guessing because he predated Newton for one thing. So Michael kind of threw this challenge at me. You need to go find out who this guy was, and see if you can prove if he knew what he was talking about. And I'm very grateful to Michael for that one remark. It was just like, go think about this. And so I did.
And I guess the particular piece that got you going was the piece entitled "A Journey Through Space," and that, I think, was written around about 1860 in good words, as you say. So, what if you were to read, and I'll put a link in the notes here online, but you can download that book now, which includes this piece. So these were articles written for the magazines, eventually compiled in 1867 in a book. So, A Journey Through Space. What was the big deal in that article?
Well, I mean, the thing that caught everybody's attention, and all kudos to Gatland for having spotted that. And I should also point out a guy called Ron Miller had probably read Gatland and or may have spotted it himself. Ron's also an expert on early rocketry. Used to run the Bonestell Space Art Archive. Ron's written some brilliant books about this, and he looked at it, and Miller actually said, this may have actually been written before 1899. So he had seen Gatland's reference, and had enough knowledge to go, there's something about this that makes me think this is even earlier than 1899. So it's very, very insightful of Ron Miller to say that. But the remark that's in there essentially talks about the rocket being the best mechanism, the best engine, if you will, for powered spaceflight, because it would work better in a vacuum than in the atmosphere. And of course, Robert Goddard had postulated these things in the 20s and been pilloried for it, but most famously by the New York Times, because at the time a lot of people believed still that you needed something to push against to make a rocket actually move forward, and these people who didn't understand Newton were saying without an atmosphere for the rocket exhaust to push against, the rocket wouldn't move. Well, Goddard famously, after he was sort of pilloried for this in the New York Times, became a recluse. He really kind of pulled his oars in and went off and did much of the rest of his work almost in total secrecy, and undoubtedly set back American rocketry by quite a few years because of that. But here is William Leitch in 1861 speaking about it as though any fool should know that this would work better in a vacuum, which makes me lead to believe that there may yet still be something else out there that Leitch had learned this from. It could have come to him from any one of those brilliant minds that were operating in the early universities in Scotland at the time. So I'm sort of still hedging my bets a little bit that he was the first, but as it stands right now, I think he still sort of holds that place of primacy.
And the key piece here is this first one, Journey Through Space. And in that, it's quite a remarkable piece. He not only talks about rockets being able to travel in space and being able to travel more efficiently in space, just as Goddard found out through practical research. But he also goes on, I mean, I should say that although he's a Presbyterian scientist, he's a man of the cloth. He is really, in all intents and purposes, as scientist as I would think of somebody with his attributes today. And he's really into astronomy. He's observed, he's got observatories, he's got telescopes, and in this piece he writes about things as well as the fact that rockets can work in a vacuum of space. He talks about, and he uses his notion of, in this article, which is quite long, of a comet as a rocket, as a vehicle to travel through space, or rather, at least through the solar system initially anyway. And he's traveling from the outer planets in towards the sun. And he talks about the moons around Neptune and how there are likely to be many more of them than we can see. And it may likely have rings around Neptune. Both of these aspects, certainly we know now to be true. He talks about the fact that when you get closer to a body that you're orbiting, you travel faster. It's all Kepler and Newtonian physics, which would have been well known by then. So he's very much bang on the science.
Yeah.
But does he actually, like Tsiolkovsky, or the Tsiolkovsky equation, for example, does he produce any quantitative work in terms of rocketry during his time?
I think, if you don't mind, I'll just step on a little bit of what you just said there, just to clarify it. One of the first reactions to when I published this was that his essay, A Journey Through Space, was a work of science fiction, and it clearly is not. It is a scientific essay, and the idea of using the comet as a rocket, he's not actually saying that a comet operates like a rocket. He's not saying that, the tail is the thrust or the exhaust of a rocket. He's clearly not saying that. He understood that comets were a sort of vaporous, tenuous thing. You wouldn't even notice if you flew through its tail. He knew that, and he writes about that elsewhere. What he was suggesting was, wouldn't it be nice if we could elevate ourselves above the plane of the ecliptic and look down on the movements of the planets from above and be able to see God's work, as he phrases it, God's glory in the heavens, the motions of the planets and all of its elegance. And so he says the only way we could do that would be in a sort of fantasy environment, whereas if we could ride on a comet and it would take us out and we could then see all this mechanical magnificence from above. And so he uses the comet as a metaphor. He's not suggesting that the comet and a rocket have any parallels. As far as writing equations and that sort of thing, I don't know how much, because I'm still discovering his writings as we speak. One of the challenges that Mike Cianconi threw at me was, how do you know this guy wasn't guessing? And so I went deep down the rabbit hole to try and find out what he was writing about. And as you've pointed out, he was a keen astronomer. He was actually an expert astronomer. He was one of the few people in England and Scotland at the time that was given a free subscription to the British Astronomical Society's journal, because he was considered important enough. He was working with John Pringle Nichol, who was one of the top astronomers in Scotland at the time. So he understood astronomy in great depth. He was keenly interested in the notion of alien life, and lectured on that in great detail. It was one of the main things he lectured on for much of his life. One of the things which I found very early in my research was a reference in I think it might have been in an obituary, mentioning the fact that he had lectured on ballistics. And so I thought, well, okay, that's interesting, because that's an entirely different field to astronomy or the philosophy of alien life or whatever, or divinity and many of the other things. And so I've spent the last 8 years trying to find any references to those lectures on ballistics. And indeed, I found it. I found his lecture, the entire thing, about 3 weeks ago.
Oh,
and oh boy, does he get into it. I mean, he talks about every conceivable type of projectile you could think of, from the Colt 45 revolver, which he considered an ungentlemanly weapon because it had six bullets in it, to mortars and howitzers and you name it. And he describes them in great detail, how they function, and again makes reference to the fact that they would function better if you could fire the projectile in a vacuum. It would follow a different trajectory to in the atmosphere. So he was extremely well versed on the mathematics of ballistics. He was also something of an engineer. He studied Watt, of course, James Watt, and the steam engine and so on, and actually invented a new kind of heating system for his church, I think, in Monomal, and I think perhaps at one of the dormitories at Glasgow. So the guy was a polymath, and ended up speaking publicly about electricity. He was corresponding with Lord Kelvin about electricity. And then he even got into essentially what becomes known as relativity and Einsteinian relativity. He came across a book written in the 1840s, I think, by a German philosopher called Felix Eberty. And Eberty had written this short essay about the idea that if you could travel faster than the speed of light, and you went out into space and looked back, you would essentially be able to see back in time. And Leitch got a hold of a copy of the English edition of Eberty's book and reviewed it for one of the magazines. And I think it was 1849 that he reviewed it. And Leitch was virtually totally dismissive of Eberty's book, because he said any astronomer that knows anything about optics and light knows that this is one of the properties of it, that you know, if you went out in space faster than the speed of light, that you'd look back in time. And I was astounded when I read that. I mean, I didn't even know about Eberty's book, first of all, which I went and read. But the notion that Leitch was reviewing Eberty's book and saying, well, this is old hat, you know, we all know this. I thought that was amazing. Well, later on, I then found out that Einstein himself wrote a foreword for a later edition of Eberty's book, saying, you know, this was sort of like, you know, something that lit the fire under me. So here we've got Leitch looking at the special nature of light and time in 1849 as though, you know, we know that already.
I was just like you, gobsmacked, reading that piece in the Journey Through Space. He actually says, and I was astounded, you dig deeper into his story. This was really news to me because I was just focused on rockets. And he says in part of there, he says, talking about the rapidity of the speed of light, and he says, it is possible to turn back the hand, as in the case of a dial of a star moving away from the Earth more rapidly than the light. A person would see the hands gradually move in the reverse order.
Yep.
And I thought, this guy, from my point of view, he's writing this in 1860, but relativity. We've gone from astronautics to relativity. Astonishing.
Yeah, this was not the sort of the fundamental notion of you know, relativity that had been, you know, the idea that if you stand on a boat and the boat's moving down the river and the bank is going one way, but you seem to be standing still within the boat. You know, that goes back to the 15th century. This was a much more profound understanding of optics and light. And you know, he went further than that too, because you may have heard of a thing called the Great Debate, which took place in the 20s between two eminent scientists. I forget their names now. It'll come to me in a minute. But they were arguing about the size of the universe, and at the time they still hadn't got Hubble still hadn't sort of spotted the redshift of the expanding universe, and they were arguing about whether all of the nebula in the sky were gas clouds. And there was an argument, well, if they weren't gas clouds, what were they? Well, they might be other island universes, as they called them, or spiral galaxies. And there was a big argument. It was called the Great Debate, and forgive me for not remembering the names of the two astronomers, but
it was Hoyle and Gold, Fred Hoyle and.
No, this was earlier than that. It was. Honestly, it'll come to me.
Steady state v Big Bang.
No. This was in the 20s, and you know, I think it's in my book. Oh, Shapley, and I forget the other one's name, but anyway, Shapley was one of them.
Okay.
Yeah, and they still weren't convinced that the other nebulae that were being seen were actually potentially as far away as they seemed to be, another galaxy. And here's Leitch back in 1850 something, basically saying, well, we're pretty sure that these other objects in the sky are millions of light years away. And that astounded me, because it was like, well, why are they still arguing about this 60 years later when this seems to have been sort of settled way back then? And this is just another one of those examples of just how far ahead these guys were, particularly Leitch, seemingly.
And I found that astonishing. And I think throughout your book, you highlight so many other stunning conclusions that William Leitch, draws from what I imagine to be a lot less in terms of resource of scientific information that was available to him in his time than, of course, we have in ours. And it's polymath indeed. If I can, you mentioned that he was really interested in another aspect of something very topical, was this belief in life beyond the Earth, extraterrestrial life. And he got into quite a lot of debates with other individuals who, I remember in one particular case, who believed that there can't be any life. And both sides of the argument were using the attribute that really, if you look out there, it's big space, a big, huge universe, we don't see much life. And Leitch's argument was that, well, look, there's such a big universe, there's bound to be some life. But it was quite topical for his time.
That was interesting, Gurbir, because that argument had been believed to be settled by a guy called Bernard de Fontenelle in the 18th century, and de Fontenelle's book called on the plurality of worlds, it's a terrible word to pronounce, that one, was a brilliant piece of work for its time. He was running a risk of being burned at the stake virtually for writing the sort of thing that he did, but he did it as a fictional conversation between himself in disguise and this beautiful Marquesa who's sort of asking him philosophical questions about the universe. And de Fontenelle published the whole thing as this fictional conversation where he gradually leads the inquisitive lady to understanding the nature of the universe. And it was a brilliantly persuasive sort of treatise about the idea. And most people sort of laid it to rest after de Fontenelle. It was sort of like, well, yeah, the universe is huge. And of course, they had no idea how huge at that time. And so it sat in sort of limbo for a while until a guy called William Ewell, that's a guy who was very highly respected. He's the guy who coined the phrase scientist, if you can believe that. William Ewell published an anonymous review of the idea, and he called his paper on the plurality of worlds, or something to that effect. And so it was a deliberate sort of retake of what de Fontenelle had done. But Ewell published it anonymously, which was not uncommon in those days. You would not put your name on these things. And it hit the magazines in, I think, 1850, I want to say 52 52 or something like that, early 50s, and Ewell made this whole argument that um, when you sow grain in a field, um, not all of it sprouts to life, and so it could just as easily be that just because there are millions of stars and millions of planets, as they perceived at the time, that just as few of them might actually sprout roots. And it was a nice little sort of metaphor. But he actually made a very interesting and persuasive argument, coming from a guy who was still clinging to old school philosophy. He was a religious man and sort of driven by Christian orthodoxy to some extent, but also a very brilliant analyst and a beginning of sort of modern science. And so he published this thing. And Leitch was one of the very first, if not the very first, to jump in with a lecture, I think within 2 weeks of Ewell's reintroduction of this subject to the discussion. Leitch showed up at the town hall in St Andrews in Scotland and took the front role of challenging Ewell and doing it from the position of a very highly educated astronomer who had looked at all of the things that were out there and was struggling himself with understanding how to reconcile that with Christian orthodoxy and so on. But made apparently a very persuasive case, and I subsequently found some extracts of his lectures. That role of the sort of other voice was then taken from Leitch to some extent by a guy called David Brewster, who was one of the world's leading guys on optics. And Brewster and Leitch were on a committee together. They knew each other very well. Leitch knew both the Brewster brothers. And Brewster was outraged by Ewell's claims and wrote a whole book about it, which became a bestseller. So Brewster sort of stole a little bit of Leitch's thunder in that respect. But I believe Brewster was actually in the room when Leitch made his speech, because Brewster was living in St Andrews, and it wasn't a very big town at the time, and he knew Leitch. I think it's highly unlikely that he wouldn't have shown up for his friend's talk that day. Leitch then lectured about this for virtually the rest of his life. In fact, indeed, he did for the rest of his life, for the next 10 or 15 years. He continued to expand on that and included part of that in his book, God's Glory in the Heavens, is one big book.
Do you think that was quite close to him as a topic, as a theme, because of his ecclesiastic connections? He was a
Presbyterian. Yeah, I do. Some of his wording that he used to address the subject is incredibly profound for a man of the cloth. You know, he's basically saying, look, I forget his exact words. It'd be nice if I could just grab it and read it to you, but it's in my book. Words to the effect of, you know, just because science contradicts the word of Scripture, don't assume that the word of Scripture can't be explained a different way, or something to that effect.
And he's always reading his book, which, as I say, is available for download, God's Glory in the Heavens. It's written in with a lot of terms associated with a man of the church, if I may say so. And initially, I find that quite off-putting, but he really brings it together. I think he was much more of a scientist. I think I felt, it's a problem with me, I kept thinking, is he a scientist or is he religious, is he a man of faith? And really, it's not a sensible question in his context. It's a little bit like the debate in the early days of light being particles or waves, and you had to be one side or the other. But in reality, it doesn't work like that. It's much more.
Well, it's part of the reason I called the book Presbyterian Scientist was you know, because there was this dichotomy there, and it's quite interesting. One person I read somewhere made a remark that the title of the book sounded like a Dan Dare story or something. But you know, I couldn't think of a better way of putting it. You don't necessarily tie together a Victorian man of the cloth with science. I mean, it's not something today that we stop and think. But indeed, most of these guys, David Brewster was an exception. He was not. But most of the guys that Leitch was hanging around with were studying divinity and became ministers or whatever. and Leitch showed a level of enlightenment, I think, for his time. I mean, we're all sort of products of our time, so there are things that some people might find offensive, some of the things today, because we're sort of trying to slap 21st century rectitude onto something. It makes no sense, you know. I'm just hoping that in 100 years from now, we're not all going to be pilloried for using gas to heat our houses by our descendants. But, you know, it's not perhaps a good metaphor, but Leitch, you know, he spent a lot of his life trying to educate people. I mean, he was a teacher. He wasn't just a minister. Right from the very beginning, when he was preaching in Fife, he would go to great lengths to bring the kids out on road trips and this sort of thing, and feed them and teach them stuff about flowers and bees and botany and all this sort of stuff. And then he went on to an assortment of church committees, one of which was to try and raise money to help women in India get a better education, as he perceived it. You know, I mean, it sort of has a sort of colonial overtone to it, but I mean, the idea was we need to tell these people about steam engines and stuff like that. And then when he came to Canada, he did the same thing. I mean, he was fighting that, and indeed, I think that may have been what killed him, was that he met so much obstruction fighting to try and get equal education for people of different faiths. He actually said in one of his things, he said, look, you know, there's no point in us going and building a Presbyterian church in you know, Delhi or something, and then forcing people to come to it, and saying, hey, our club's better than, you know, the Catholics club next door. He basically said, look, we just go build the church and let them come to us if they want to. And he even argued for secularists and said, you know, if the government's giving money away to do this, we shouldn't stand in the way of the secularists getting some of this money to say what they want to say. Let the Catholics have their piece of the pie. We'll have our piece of the pie. And if we have a reasonable argument to make, people will come to us. And, you know, he got in a lot of trouble for making arguments like that.
And he's such an enlightened individual. You mentioned he was a teacher, and referenced Scotland quite a few times. So he's born in Rothesay in Scotland, and he died in Canada. Can you just summarize his life story, and why did he end up in Canada?
Well, he as you point out, he was born in Rothesay. His parents and grandparents had been ministers on the Isle of Bute, and that's just sort of west of Glasgow. And when he was old enough, he was sent to Glasgow University, and of course, it was famous mostly for the fact that James Watt had come out of there, and he studied all manner of things, including astronomy. He won notable prizes as a student there. He got his BA and his MA there. One of the things which I haven't proven conclusively, but God knows I tried, was that I'm pretty sure that at one point he was teaching Lord Kelvin, who at the time his name was William Thomson. He was a young man, but Lord Kelvin went on to become the most famous scientist of the Victorian era. I'm pretty sure Leitch taught him natural philosophy, which is what we call science today, but also astronomy. Leitch then was offered a ministership at, it's not the word for it, but he was offered a ministry at the request of, I think, the Earl of Leven, who brought him to Fife, where he took over at the church there in a little village called Monimal. And that's where he started to do his science lectures and astronomy lectures. He married a lady from there called Euphemia Patterson, and they had a couple of kids. Euphemia died young, and Leitch then handed his kids over to his sister, I think, or his wife's sister, I forget now, in St Andrews. And he was obviously very depressed because, you know, he'd lost his wife, and he sat sort of stewing there for about a year, and his friends were worried about him. And then some people from Kingston, Ontario, here in Canada, Kingston at the time being the capital of Canada, came over looking for somebody to take over as principal of Queen's University in Kingston. And he was nominated by one of his friends, a guy called Norman MacLeod, who was one of Queen Victoria's ministers. He nominated Leitch for the job, and Leitch discussed it. A lot of his friends were very reluctant to see him leave because he was contributing so much to the community, particularly science writings. But then his other friends were saying, maybe this would be good for you, a new start. So he went, and he arrived here in Canada in 1860, and sort of investigated, so did some groundwork to see whether he was going to like to do this, which he subsequently agreed to. And then he went back and forth between Canada and Scotland every summer for the next 2 or 3 years, running at his job as principal of Queen's while going home to tend to affairs in Scotland with his kids and that sort of thing. And then in 1864, he ventured out, 1863, ventured out into the wilds of Canada, so to speak, went and visited the Maritimes, and probably overworked himself, may have caught pneumonia or something like that, and came back and succumbed to his illness at the age of 49 in 1864. So short life for a guy like that.
And you mentioned a few moments ago about his efforts in trying to get the this is when he's in Canada and trying to be the principal at Queen's University, trying to dish out equally or evenly, or trying to, the income that's coming from the government. And that appears from your book to be the hardest part in his life, just dealing with the politics and the economics of running a big university.
Yeah, you have to remember that the way that taxation worked back then in Scotland and in Canada was a lot different to the way it is today, because there was still the crown had more of a sort of claw in there in some respects. In Scotland, he had fought to make sure that the taxes that were being collected on behalf of the church actually went to the church, as opposed to being siphoned off to something else that they were not meant for. But so he had some experience with that. But when he came to Canada, Queen's College, as it was at the time, was one of a group of colleges scattered around Lower Canada, as it was called. And there was no system really in place where the colleges would do the education and the university would then distribute the doctorates. There was no sort of organization, and he was familiar with the way that was organized in Britain. And so when he came over here, he said, we should try and organize this, because each college also had a church behind it. And in the case of Queen's, it was the Presbyterian church that was behind it. And then there were these other colleges that had the Catholic Church behind them and so on. And so what happened was, before Leitch even arrived, supposedly, well, this is actually true, the Crown in England had decided to allow a bunch of the King's land, which I use the word in inverted commas, the King's land to be sold off. And the money would then be given to the colleges to grow education in Canada. And so a huge chunk of land, which today would be worth millions and millions and millions of dollars, not far from where I'm sitting right now, was then sold off. And the city of Toronto sits on much of that land now. And the money, which was then supposed to have been divvied up between these colleges, didn't get divvied up the way it was supposed to. And Leitch took exception to that. Well, actually, before he even got here, Queen's took exception to it. Leitch kind of got thrown in the deep end and tried to fight their corner. And ultimately, he ended up as a senator on the Senate of the University of Toronto, and earned a lot of respect there. And there's a lot of newspaper articles quoting him here in the local papers from the time. But it was a bad, difficult fight. And to this day, there was some would argue that Queen's and some of the other colleges never really got their piece of that pie. It was essentially hogged by what became the University of Toronto. So tough fight.
and it seems to be he seems to be in a place where I think quite rightly he should have been. He understood the value of science and about communicating through his teaching experience, but he just didn't seem to get the kind of support that he needed.
And yet he still found time to found the Canadian Botanical Society. And he found the time to establish a permanent observatory at Kingston University, or Kingston College. And some of his stories, which I relate in my book, about his trips south of the border during the American Civil War or just prior to the American Civil War, and things that he wrote which appeared in Scientific American magazine.
And your book opens with a reminder for those who may not be familiar with the origins of modern rocketry. You start off with Jules Verne, Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, Oberth, but you also include the other Hermann Ganswit, and I was quite pleased to see that. Is that name you don't normally see associated with Tsiolkovsky and the early pioneers? Do you think that Ganswit's name has not really achieved the prominence that it should have?
Well, I had to put it in there because he did have some precedence. The idea of using rocket, propulsion, or at least the idea of throwing mass behind you. I don't know if he was using solid pellets of fuel. I forget now. I don't think it certainly wasn't a liquid rocket. It was some kind of solid rocket. He certainly wrote about that, at least the research that I was able to find. I dug into the original sources, of course, were Willy Ley and his book, Rockets and Missiles, and the various iterations of that book. But I went and read Ganswit's own writings, such as they are, that you can find. And he certainly had some precedence, and I felt like I should at least address that, because if you're going to start talking about predating Tsiolkovsky, there are others. And of course, there's, as I mentioned earlier, Cyrano de Bergerac. But Cyrano was writing from a world without Newton and had no idea why rockets would work in space. That they might. Didn't really have any concept of the idea of the atmosphere ending either. But Ganswit had some understanding of these things and had written about them. So I felt including him was important.
I'm really glad that you did, because I think his name gets missed far too often. Did you come across a guy called Nikolai Kabalchich?
Yes, and he was one of the guys who I want to remember if I've got the right name here now. Was he the one that was incarcerated by the Tsar for being involved with the plot?
Yeah, he was involved in the plot.
Yes,
Alexander
I did.
II.
And I think I write about him in the book. I'm pretty sure I did. The Russian names sometimes confuse me, because there was another Russian who had written about rockets for spaceflight that Tsiolkovsky claimed as an inspiration, and I mentioned him in there, and the names confuse me. But Kibalchich, yeah, he was writing about rocket propulsion, or I can't think of the word for it now. Mass project, anyway, rocket propulsion.
Solid
reaction propulsion is the word I was looking for. Reaction engines. He was writing about them from his prison cell because he had been implicated in a plot to kill the Tsar, and so he wrote all this stuff down while he was in prison in, I want to say, the late 19th century.
1881.
Around the time of Ganswit. And of course, nobody got to read his stuff until long after he was dead. After the Russian Revolution, his writings were found and spread around a little bit. Because at that point, of course, the Soviet Union, everybody was looking for primacy and saying that we came up with this first. And the Soviets, or the Russians, certainly had a legitimate argument to make for that. Tsiolkovsky's contributions are, incontestable.
So most of the four of the people you deal with at the beginning of your book, where you introduce the reader to, Tsiolkovsky, Goddard, and Oberth, were not Leitch's contemporaries, but Jules Verne was. But Jules Verne, he never met him, but he came close.
Yeah. Yeah, that was extraordinary. I don't know what made me go looking for this, but I suddenly thought, I wonder if Jules Verne ever went to Scotland. I had no idea. And the funny thing is, I should have remembered, because somewhere on the shelf behind me here, I have Verne's biography written by his grandson. And of course, he talks about it. He talks about Verne going to Scotland in 1859. And when I went down that particular hole, I found out that Verne had novelized his trip to Scotland in a work of fiction. It's a semi-autobiographical work of fiction, but it hadn't been published, and I don't think it was published until 1990 something in English, and 1980 something in French, and it's now considered to have been his first work of fiction. But it was basically him just taking his trip to Scotland and novelizing it. And it turned out that in his papers and his diaries and everything else, it pinned down the exact dates that he was in Edinburgh. And I happened to know that Leitch was in Edinburgh the same day or the day after. I then went and looked at the locations of where they were in Scotland, Edinburgh that day, and Verne was gracious enough to tell us what hotel he was staying in, what street it was on, and Leitch, told us what day he was there and who he was meeting with, and so I put them probably within, perhaps meters of each other on a given day in 1859, which I thought was just astonishing. Not that it happened so much as that we were able to know that it happened.
Well, I was really, I don't know why, I was really excited to hear that. I mean, in practice, because they never met, it doesn't amount to much, but it really is fascinating that they did come so close. Yeah. I remember when I was writing my very first book, I was wondering if Korolev and Werner von Braun ever met, because Korolev came over just after the war ended, just like many other countries came over to pick the bones of the Russian, the German V2s and the aircraft and aviation. But as far as I was aware, although Korolev was in Germany at the same, just before von Braun left, they never met either. But
Korolev was there to witness the British launches of captured V2s that happened at Cuxhaven. That was it. Yeah, Cuxhaven. Yeah, near the canal there in northern Germany. And he was there, I believe, very discreetly. In sort of almost incognito. He'd been given a nominal commission in the Red Army or something. Von Braun, on the other hand, been scuttled off, but he did go back to Germany. Von Braun went back to Germany in 1949, I think, and that's something that's not generally known about. He was taken back there to be interrogated again by British intelligence because they thought he was holding out on them, and so they asked the Americans if they bring him back, and so he did go back in 1949 to sit through another interrogation session.
Just as an aside, probably earlier than that, or could be at the same time, when he came to Europe, he came to England, von Braun, and he was interrogated, amongst others, by Eric Brown, the RAF pilot who spoke German, and he interrogated so many of the others. And Eric Brown, was sent to Germany again to pick over the German technology to see what could be brought back here. But we've spoken quite at length about the connections that William Leitch had with the church, and how his writing was had a lot of the ecclesiastical vocabulary. But despite that, it's pretty much all scientific work that he was working on. But the reason why his work was lost, and until you discovered it and wrote about him, was it because it was misclassified as work of the church and not science, you think?
Partly. I went through library databases to see where the book existed, where it actually was located in libraries around the world, and about 50% of the time it was in the theology section, and about 50% of the time it was listed under astronomy. That was an interesting exercise, but I think part of the reason that his work was completely disassociated from him, and not entirely forgotten, but completely disassociated from him, was he died so young, and his copyright had been used as collateral by his publisher. And so when the publisher went out of business, the copyrights were swapped around like bitcoins, and nobody quite knew who had them. And so when they started republishing his essay, A Journey Through Space, separately from the rest of the book, it was never attributed to him, and it remained in print from 1861 until at least 1910, which I thought was fascinating, because then that started to put it in the realm of discovery by Goddard. And indeed, when I went further into that, I found out that there was several copies of his essay in libraries in Boston when Robert Goddard was a kid studying in school there. Indeed, there was one copy in the library at the school where Goddard went to school, right when Goddard was getting interested in rockets and spaceflight. And that then led me to the fact that Leitch and Goddard actually shared a correspondent. They both were corresponding at different times with Orson Munn, the editor of Scientific American. And
Wow.
so they were one person separated by correspondence, indeed at a different time. And then I found out that a copy of Leitch's book was in the library of a guy called Theodore Richards, who was a Nobel Prize winning chemist, who won his Nobel Prize for his work on hydrogen and oxygen. And Goddard knew Theodore Richards, and I even have a photograph of them together in the latest edition of my William Leitch book. So Theodore Richards had been reading Leitch for 30 years, because the copy that he has or had is still in a library in Boston with the date that he was given it written, inscribed on the inside. And so, Richards knew about Leitch for at least 30 years when he met Goddard. And that was really interesting to see just how close they came in several different ways. And I think it's not beyond the realm of reason to think that Goddard probably read Leitch's book because it was in the school library where he went to school.
Fascinating, those connections, aren't they?
Yeah.
I remember when I was writing my Stephen Smith book, and I came across a letter in which Edward Pendray, the founder of the American Interplanetary Society, was communicating with Phil Cleater, founder of the British Interplanetary Society, and Cleater saying, "Oh, I can pass you on details about this guy who's testing rockets in India," and Pendray saying, "Okay, I'll send you some details of this guy called Goddard doing some experiments with rockets." Very different scenarios, but it's just a unusual.
Yeah, well, it's great finding this stuff. It's like finding buried treasure. It's what gets me up in the morning sometimes is looking for stuff like this.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that you had asked me earlier when we were talking earlier was, what was the reaction to my book when it came out? And as I said, that there were some naysayers who took it upon themselves to make statements about what I was claiming, and clearly hadn't read Leitch. It was saying that his book was a work of fiction, or he was saying that we should go all ride on a comet like it was the horse or something. And if you actually go and read Leitch, and I hope read my book, which I hope puts it all in some context and gives you a narrative to go behind the work, you'll find that there are things that we take for granted, particularly in this field as in any other, that we shouldn't necessarily take for granted. And I've had a huge amount of fun, sort of kicking over the apple cart a few times with this sort of thing. And it upsets people, unfortunately, but I would rather find the truth of these things than stick with dogma, which of course is one of Leitch's credos. That was one of the things that he stuck by.
Tell me about the impact of the role of Chris Hadfield after you published this work.
Yeah, well, when I first announced that I'd found this, I was just going to deliver it as a quiet little paper in North Bay, Ontario, which is way north of where I am here, for Space Day, and Chris happened to be there to speak about it, to speak about his flights, and he saw my little press release about Leitch, and I guess tweeted it, and because he had 25 million followers at the time. And the next thing I know, the world went bonkers. I mean, it was on 9,000 different news sites in at least 15 languages. It was in Associated Press, the Daily Mail, the Guardian in England. It made the New York Times briefly over here, and then somebody persuaded them to take it down because they said it was all wrong. And I thought it was kind of ironic that the New York Times would fight that because they were the ones that took down Goddard. But
they did apologize at the end, so they'll come.
Yeah, they apologized to Goddard after he was long dead. So
there's an apology coming to your way. So that's the popular reception of the book. What kind of reception have you had within the more nerdy environments of the interplanetary or rocketry society world?
I was extremely pleased to get a great review from British Interplanetary Society Spaceflight magazine. They gave me a really good review. I started to get feedback from some people who I knew that teach this subject at various academic institutions, and some of them were phoning me up and saying, "What? How come? What?" And then saying, "Well, I've got to add this to my curriculum," and that kind of thing. So that's been really nice. I was particularly gratified to see that somebody nominated Leitch to be on the £50 note in England when they were arguing over who to put on it. Admittedly, there was 900 and something other people that were nominated, but Leitch was one of them, and I think that was that. I don't think anybody had ever heard of him until I put this book out. So it's been interesting in that respect, but it still hasn't quite permeated the zeitgeist yet. Just recently, I came across a reference. I can't remember what it was. It was on a website somewhere, and the person was clearly writing from no knowledge whatsoever, and it was an academic website too. And they were saying that his story, A Journey Through Space, was about a trip to the moon. It was a science fiction story about a trip to the moon. And I was like, I have no idea where they could possibly have got that assumption from, because it has no bearing on the truth at all.
Well, I think it's a tremendous effort you put in there to bring this guy out of the darkness, certainly for me. You mentioned you're working on a new edition. What will the new edition contain that's new, and when should we expect it?
Well, the most interesting thing I've found, because the reason we're doing a new edition mainly is because it's going to be out of print very shortly, and so I figured if we're going to print more, we might as well add new stuff to it. The most interesting stuff that I found was all of those writings about ballistics, which I had been looking for the last 8 years. So I'll be adding that stuff in there. Since the first edition, I found so much more stuff. I found out about those references that I just made to Scientific American and his connection with that one guy that also knew Goddard. So I've added that stuff with the photo of Theodore Richards. That's been added to the most recent edition. I enjoyed connecting him to his granddaughter as well, who became a world famous golfer, and literally world famous. I mean, she was right there on the front page of the newspapers with Charles Lindbergh when he crossed the Atlantic. She was that famous. So I thought there was some interesting stuff there, but there's a lot of nuance and details and little things, and I've actually restructured the text to try and put them into some sort of chronological order. There's been, going back to your previous question, Strathclyde University in Scotland now has a astronautics scholarship named after William Leitch, which they give out every year now, and that was really gratifying to see that. An organization in Scotland tried to get one of the blue plaques put at his place of birth on the Isle of Bute, but didn't yet succeed with that because the committee that organizes that said that he did his most important work in Canada, which is actually not established. He may well have written these essays when he was in Scotland. And then at Queen's University here in Canada, they put a big brushed steel plaque in the grounds of the university with a picture of Leitch and writing about, his contributions to the university, but also his contributions apparently to science. And that's in full view and apparently going to be there for 100 years or more. So that's nice. It's those have been really gratifying to see that.
And that's down to the time and effort you put into this. One last question. As I say, I'm so embarrassed that I hadn't come across William Leitch and his work until I came across your book, and that was a few years after you published it. To what extent do you think the message hasn't got out there is down to the fact that most people know of Apogee Books and the tremendous work that you've done in history of space. But do you think if this book was published by, I don't know, Oxford University Press or something, that it would have perhaps had a higher reach?
Absolutely. No question in my mind. I mean, we're a small publishing house, and those guys have got much deeper pools to dip into than we do, financially and, with their sort of reputation going back centuries. Certainly, if it had had that kind of academic endorsement at that level, it would have been out there much more so. But we're also dealing in a world now that's a little different than even it was 10 or 15 years ago, where you're trying to overcome the inertia that's embedded in the internet. And there's so much bad information, and sad to say, part of it propagated by the notion that anybody can rewrite Wikipedia. It's very hard to keep overcoming that. It's like a full-time job for a lot of people to maintain some momentum. I was very pleased to see that somebody had added Leitch to, I think, the history of rocketry or something on Wikipedia. I didn't do that. Somebody else put it on there. I could as easily have done, but I try not to do those kind of, self-serving things, because it sort of diminishes the impact of what you're trying to say. You need to earn it rather than ram it down people's throats. So it's out there in certain places now. I'd like to see it, hit other scholars, and so that they would go out and maybe do a better job than me. I know that there's at least one highly acclaimed scientist and highly awarded scientist in Scotland who found out about Leitch through my book and was invited to give a speech about Leitch at some big dinner in Scotland a little while back. So
I think it's an astonishing achievement, as well as the story about William Leitch. The story on how you actually brought it out into the open is a fascinating one.
Well, Leitch takes most of the credit, and Mike Cianconi takes a bunch of it too.
Well,
he needs to, I should say. He doesn't take it, but he needs to.
Well, I think you deserve a big chunk of that too. And,
thank you.
When does edition 4 come out?
I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think we have about 8 copies left of the current edition.
Right.
And once those are gone, then I will reprint it and I'll add a little bit more. It'll only be, a few more pages probably.
Well, Rob Goodwin, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate it. It's a very short journey through this fascinating story. We'll have to have another chat to catch up with the 4th edition.
Thank you, Gurbir.
Lovely. Thanks very much. Take care, and I'll see you soon.